Well, some of you may know that I like to have an opening song while we're, waiting for people to come in, but I was a little bit late. So we skipped the song today, but as of next week, we'll be using a recording of one of the Psalms, Shiru Ladonai Shir Chadash, Sing to the Lord a new song that I recorded years ago in Tel Aviv with some of our daughters. And we'll do that next week. But the reason is that this is a new song, folks. This is a text that neither Steve or I have taught before, and and I've never looked into it in depth. I've used it quotes here and there. I don't know about you, Steve, but I don't think so. I think this was your first time reading the text, correct?
It is, yeah. Although Frederick Buechner, he's an author who is he wrote a novella on Tobit from the point of view of Raphael the angel.
Uh-huh.
Frederick Buechner. It's great. He tells the whole story, but from Raphael's perspective.
So a contemporary midrash on the ancient text.
Mm,
Okay, then.
exactly.
So, we don't need to do too many introductions from a methodological point of view because I think not everybody here has studied with us before. If not with both of us together, then certainly with each of us individually. I'm not sure, Steve, you've met Rabbi Malka before. I don't remember if she's participated in any of our classes, but she does a lot of the other work we do, or Les Zendel as well. The rest of the folks, Wayne, everybody here, I think has done before, and Malka and Les, you'll get to know the different characters of the story here on the screen, because each of us are characters with our own narratives, as we combine our own narratives and impressions with this text. Uh, a few words, initial words about the where this text comes from, what we know, what we don't know. Let's start with the fact we don't know a lot. We don't know exactly when it was written or where it was written. And when you look at critical commentaries, I've been using Kerry Moore's. It's not that new, but it's from the Anchor Bible series. Moore has done a lot of work on the late books like Esther and Danielle, and Judith, and some of the apocryphal works as well. So when we say apocrypha, what do we mean from a Jewish point of view? I'm going to give you the quick story that the way that I understand it, which is not necessarily the most up to date because I haven't been in the academic world, but this is at least how I understand. There were various sacred books out there 2,500 years ago, let's say right now, 2,200 years ago. And some of those books were held more sacred or less sacred by different communities. It was never one people of Israel, ever. Any reading of the Hebrew Bible tells you that, right? There was never one. And then afterwards, when it was mostly the Judeans that were later called the people, the Jews, it still wasn't, as reflected in the narratives of the New Testament as well. There was, and the Talmud. We have this kind of weird tunnel vision if we grew up in Jewish education, as if the rabbis of the Talmud are the continuation of the ancestors of biblical time. Anyway, the books that are held holy in the land of Israel by the sages who we call Chazal, the Chachamim Zichronam Livracha, the rabbis of the Talmud, are the ones that are in, and only some of them, by the way, are the ones that are in the canon, the Jewish canon of 24 books. When we speak of canonization in the Jewish tradition, there was a time, late 19th, early 20th century, where Jewish scholars of Jewish studies, which was a new field, right? They wrote about they wrote about an assumed, a presumed synod of rabbis in Jamnia, which we call Yavne. Now, Yavne is close to my heart because I went to Yeshivat Kerem B'Yavne. I went to the seminary that I went to when I was 18, the combined army service with Talmud study or with Torah study, was in very close to that place, which is Tel Yibne. And that's an important place from a historical point of view. But what the historians were doing is they were projecting from what they knew about the church and canonization in the church on to the rabbis, as if the rabbis were like the church fathers that had different synods that decide. And I'll let you speak to that, Steve. What books were in, what books were out. Now, New Testament had its own process there. What the Hebrew Bible, we know in the end what was accepted just by what was left over. There are few debates in the Talmud itself, extremely few, about books like Song of Songs, about Ecclesiastes, even a kind of a mini debate about Proverbs that we looked at the other day. Some of us that study Proverbs, it was actually yesterday. Should this book be in or should it be out? So that we, in the end, we have what we have, and that's been that way since, but basically since Talmudic literature is the only text quoted outside of the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible in Talmud is Sirah, Sirah or Ben Sirah, the wisdom of Ben Sirah, the wisdom of Sirah, and so that shows us it was at the edge, it was on the tip, and that's a book from the 2nd century BCE. We know because the grandson of the author left us that document. So, but there was another canon. Now this is more me speaking my understanding, and that canon was of the Jewish community of Alexandria. I didn't make this stuff up, of course, but this is how I see it as a canon. And we have that canon reflected in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, and that collection of books has more books in it. It has books like Judith and Maccabees and Tobit. I may sometimes call it Tobit. That's what I called it over the years, but Sefer Tuvia. I'll try to say Tobit. We'll keep on the same. And those books we call apocryphal. Those books, and there's some additions to some of the Hebrew Bible books that we know as well, like Esther and Daniel, the story of Shoshana. For those that are interested, I'll be giving a mini course that starts on Monday, this Monday, with the Jewish Collaborative of Orange County on women in the Apocrypha. And I'll be starting with the additions to Esther and Daniel. And if you have interest in that, Madalena, perhaps you can put a link to that. Sign up in the comments here if anybody here doesn't get the whatever we send out. Also, it should be in the. Did we put it in the Oramid bar? Anyway, back to this. Okay, so back to this is we have this canon in Greek, and we can often, and we use it sometimes to correct the text of the Hebrew we have. But my point is that the Jews of Alexandria in Egypt that spoke Greek, they had their own Bible, which was different than ours. It had more books. Some of the books are different, or very different. The book of Jeremiah is quite different than it is in the Hebrew text that we have. And so we know that it was sacred. Now, another thing that's happened here is that this particular text is also found in Qumran. And we'll get to a piece today. Well, I'll show you a fragment from chapter 1 of Tobit, from what's called 4Q, the fourth cave in Qumran, which has given some of the most delightful examples of alternate biblical literature. And this particular text is dated to the 1st century BCE. So as early as, or at least, or I should say as late as BC, that was probably a book that was part of the canon of the Jewish community in Qumran. And all this is important for the point of pluralism, to know that what we know as Judaism is very narrow, and I would imagine the same thing could be said about Christianity. And but in the end, this book was preserved by the church for us Jews. It was the church that preserved it in different languages, and we were able to, as a Jewish people, Jewish culture, to rediscover this book in a serious way in the 19th century. Why Jewish scholars that knew Greek, that knew Latin, that knew other languages, and retranslated. This book has been retranslated into Hebrew in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, in a really interesting project that I'll talk about on another day, by Abraham Kahana, who put out these apocryphal books in Hebrew, rendering them back into what he assumed would be the original language. So, what do we have? We have Greek, we have Latin, very complicated because there's many recensions of the Greek. There's two separate translations of the Latin. in other languages as well. We can't go too much into detail because we'll lose ourselves.
Uh,
Will we? Go ahead.
he translated it into Hebrew from what original language? From the Greek
Yeah,
or
so
from?
Avram Kahana, I will speak. I did some
Yeah.
work on it years ago, and I need to look for those notes. But Avram Kahana was the in charge of the project. He had other scholars working with him, and it started in Lvov, maybe. It started in Ukraine, and then it moved to Israel, moved to Tel Aviv at some point. And the different scholars did. They took what languages they had. Some were in Greek, they used Latin as well. Some were like Ethiopic, all sorts of languages that were preserved in the church. Um,
Okay.
okay, but back to this. So one of the questions is going to be what language was this book written in, and there's still a debate whether it was written in Aramaic or Hebrew. I can't weigh into that. I'm not. This is some of the stuff here is way above my pay grade, and so we don't know where. We don't exactly know when. Uh, Sometime between the fourth and the second century, many scholars say. So it reflects a particular time of and not necessarily Jewish because the as is in the tribe of Judah because as we'll see the character comes from the tribe of Naphtali, but who wrote it, to what purpose, all those things we'll find out in the first chapter where, when, what, but we won't know yet the why and the how, and that's what we'll yeah, yeah. And so Rabbi Malk was asking, was this book in fragments exist? I don't think so. I don't think so. I'd have to check, but nothing like say Ben Sirah, which was found in the Cairo Geniza. Great question though. So that's kind of my semi introduction now. I don't learn too much history from this. The names are kind of a little bit messed up, a little bit don't match what we know from historical point of view. But Steve, perhaps you'll have a different approach. And in general, the bottom line is not a sacred book in the Jewish tradition today. I would say for me, it's sacred because it was sacred to the Jews of Alexandria, and because it's part of our shared experience. I would say it's more sacred to me as a rabbi than perhaps the Gospels. Not perhaps than the Gospels are. Although for me, there's a certain amount of holiness to the New Testament as well because of the work that I'm engaged in. But that's the bottom line, and I'm really excited we're doing this. Steve, why don't you give us your perspective? Oh, Ajit, sorry.
Is Tobit, I guess if I'm pronouncing, I've never come across it before. Is it theologically significant for the Jewish or the Christian community? Does it add or enhance the theology in any way?
I don't know, and because Moore is not a Jewish scholar, and so I need to go back to the introduction in Kahana's collection anthology to see what he might say. Although they represent not particularly traditional Jewish scholars. They were more secular Jewish than Israeli scholars. Um, but I don't think so. But we may find something. We may find something that we find. And to me, that's the most important thing. What do we, you as a Baha'i, us as Christians and Jews, and whoever else is watching this? Yeah. But I'll let Steve answer that from a Christian point of view.
Well, so yeah, the Apocrypha or the hidden books, in that period between 400 BCE and the first century CE, uh, I think that whole body of literature that we have been biased against just because it's not as Christians, unless you're Roman Catholic, they consider it part of the canon. But Protestants, as David said, adopted wholeheartedly the canon that the Jews decreed at Yavnia, and then these deuterocanonical or these apocryphal books that we have found in this collection. I think they're very significant because they remind for a Christian, when I open up the book of the Gospel of Mark, that presupposes so many things that a 21st century man like myself, just when I open up the Gospel of Mark, I'm just automatically, missing so much. Tobit fills in some of the diasporan Jewish experience, I assume, because my research tells me that while the story talks about uh, uh, Tobit and his family living in exile in Nineveh, right after the 10 tribes were taken out to and dispersed, Tobit finds himself in Nineveh, in Assyria, in what, 8th BCE century. That's the setting of the story. But in fact, I would put it around before the book of Maccabees, at least, but maybe 200 BCE. And yet, uh, it it reminds me of books like Jonah and the book of Job, and also uh, Tobit himself and his story kind of reminds me of Joseph in the at the end of Genesis. Um, but I do think for me, the experience of the Jewish people after the exile and the dispersion across the known ancient world, it's telling the practices of Tobit that enabled him to hang on to his identity in the midst of foreign lands with foreign gods and the whole bit. So, and the piety in the New Testament that comes across. Uh, Now, when I read that in light of Tobit, it enriches it for me. It reminds me that long tradition of being Jewish over many, many ages in different places. This just gives me a little access into that way of thinking.
I just want to reiterate the point about Jamnia. Yavne was that today no historians think there was a decision made in Yavne. That was something projected by earlier
About the
historians.
canon?
Yeah, that there was no meeting, there was no decision. There were ongoing conversations that we have just the fragments of in the Talmud, but the bottom line is in the books that we have. That's what we know. There was no voting on, right? And so that's still you find that in some history books, but I don't think that any of the updated modern contemporary historians see it that way as well.
Uh,
Yes.
so you're placing this in the Second Temple period.
Hmm.
Uh,
Right? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, and you're placing this in the. Are we saying that he was part of the Babylonian exile? Was he? I guess I don't know where the city of Nineveh is.
So we're talking about Assyrian exiles, but I'm going to
Oh,
suggest that we go to the first chapter where
okay,
where the author sets this up for us. Okay,
okay.
and what to be careful of, I think, or to be critical of, Ajit, is what do we get from the background of the story as far as the what some Jewish authors knew, and then to try to figure out, so what was the at some point was the background of the actual author, the fact that he's telling a story that happened perhaps hundreds of years beforehand. Yes, Don.
Is there any truth that Martin Luther withheld these apocryphal books from the Protestant Bible?
Well, yeah, I don't know if it's just Martin Luther, but yes, that's when the change was made. Um,
Yes.
Luther, there's a quote that I would imagine I've shared with this group before. It's what I remember from years ago in the 80s, that Luther once wrote that he prayed and he had wished that two books were not included in the canon. Those two books were Maccabees. He considered them at 1 and 2 to be the same, Maccabees and Esther. And his reason is because they're so Jewish. And he's right. They're very Jewish as far as, being Israelitish. And so this book would fall into that category as well.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment in connection with what Steve said about uplifting the Christian scriptures when he reads this. But when you look at the background of the place where he was from, Naphtali, and when you start to examine what those names mean, and the situation between Rachel and Leah, this is a holy kind of description, a holy book. And I was thumbing through it, and in chapter 13, there's a beautiful prayer that is, I would say, Jewish.
Right. So I'm going to suggest we actually start the text. Okay?
Now, one last thing about starting the text now, David, is just that I've talked to a handful of folks who want to be part of this group, but for one reason or another, the notice went out a little late in Fredericksburg. So if we don't mind reviewing a bit next week, assuming that we'll have a few more folks join us.
Right. And please share the fact that all they need to do is RSVP, and they'll be on the list of, this is recorded now.
That's right. I forgot about the
Right.
recording.
And all that. So, as they're driving to work, or in your case, of most of your guys, as they're driving to retirement, they can listen to it in the car. Yeah. And we want to congratulate Steve and his wife on their new home in Fredericksburg, where I think you are broadcasting from. You're totally resettled by this point, correct?
Yep, with your dear cousins.
Great. All right, folks. So, Don, why don't you do us the honors of reading from the first page? I sent out the text. I'll try to do, you folks know what I'm doing. I'm going to try to do it a little bit format-wise to help us differentiate between the text itself and the additional text that I bring as background, or what happens, background. Let's call it background. So if you could read the first section for us, Don.
The book of the words of Tobit, son of Tobiel, son of Hananiel, son of Aduel, son of Gabael, son of Raphael, son of Raguel, of the descendants of Asiel, of the tribe of Naphtali, who in the days of King Shalmaneser of the Assyrians was taken into captivity from Thisbe, which is to the south of Kadesh, Naphtali, and Upper Galilee, above Asher, towards the west and north of Fogur.
Now, we could bring a map, but maps are very, speculative in any case. But let's talk about first the place. Naphtali's land was to the left, that is to the west of the Sea of Galilee, upper part of Sea of Galilee, and what's called the Hula Valley, which it was once a swamp lake, kind of okay. Anyway, we're talking about the Galilee, north of the sea of the Kinneret, up towards where the kibbutzim are, in that area there, Rosh Pinah.
Close to Lebanon.
I don't know if it goes all the way up, Naphtali,
Okay.
because there may have been, Dan was up at the top, I think, may have been cut off by Dan. This is the second iteration of Dan. Dan will come up in later on today. The tribe of Dan was originally down below, next to Judah, and but their land was settled mostly with Philistines, and they were constantly under pressure from Philistines. At some point, they move up from that area near Tel Aviv. That's why Tel Aviv is called Gush Dan, the Dan block. They move up to the Galilee, and that'll be important for something that's coming up soon that he claims. So the names are theophoric names. Theophoric meaning they have God in the name itself. There's two kind of basic theophoric names. It's far more complicated than this, but what I can remember to say usually to explain is that there's the ones that end with Yah or Yahu, and the ones that end with El. So Raphael, Gabriel, like the names of angels, Yisrael, that and Albright, had this theory as to where they come from, J, E, and the prehistoric background of these names. But what we have here are those kinds of names like Tobiel and Hananel, and many of them are like that. Raguel, by the way, which you won't find. This I'm speaking especially for the Hebrew speakers and readers here, is the Greek changing of an ayin. It's Ruel, the friend of God, or God is my friend, and the ayin in Greek becomes a gamma, like Aza and Gaza, Amora and Gomorrah, right? Okay. Anyway, all those places, and all those names, the son, Tobit, Tovia, most probably, it had to have that the T was added in the Greek translation, and I don't think that we have the name in the Aramaic. I'll have to check and see if the name is mentioned, see how it is in the Qumran scrolls. But in any way, that is probably Tovia, right? So like Tuvia, or from Fiddler on the Roof, Tevya. Tevya is what happened to the name Tuvia, and in Hebrew, God is good, or God is my good. Geographically, so those are the names. Wise, and the last thing we have here is Shalmaneser. So to answer your question, Ajit, this is from the time of the captivity of the Assyrian. This is before the Babylonian. And so the Assyrian exile, and that was also done in stages. I think, did we do that in this group at all? I don't think so. In Isaiah?
Yeah, we did Isaiah.
No, but in second Isaiah, did we talk about the different exiles? I don't remember. Recently, we've done it in something, but I don't remember in what. Okay.
Somewhere after 722 BCE.
Yeah. Okay. So, Don, why don't you read for us some of the background from the Book of Kings?
In the days of King Pekah of Israel, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria came and captured Ijon, Abel Beth Makkah, Janoah, Kadesh, Hazor, Gilead, Galilee, the entire region of Naphtali, and he deported the inhabitants to Assyria. In the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Assyria, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Halah, at the river Habor, at the river Gozan, in the town of Media.
So, I guess is this, Ajit? Is this a theological addition that we have here? No, it's theological in that the storyteller is telling us this is ancient sacred literature that comes from an experience of exile. I think that was kind of Steve's point as well. And so there's a theological importance to that. And we don't have very many books. That we have the book of Daniel that tells us that experience. We have the book of Esther that tells us that experience of what it is to be an Israelite / Jew in exile, which is an existential thing. I mean, we saw it when we studied the Acts of the Apostles together in a very different way. Mm-hmm. What happens when that word, that faith in Jesus?
Oh.
Uh-oh. Rabbi got frozen. He's still human. He hasn't turned into a pillar of salt.
I just texted him to let him know whether he'll see it or not. I don't know.
I'm sure he'll be back in a minute.
He has to disconnect and connect again, I think.
Okay, I'm back. I'm very, very impressed. That was very impressive. Little Muzak there. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know internet connection. Where I left off was where there's one scholar from the 19th century who postulated that the whole now that's been there's other bands, but this idea of the lost tribes who exist in different places in Africa and wherever in Asia. So it says my internet connection is unstable. What can I do? All right. So now if you would, Don, is Don still here? No. Oh yeah, everybody's rearranged. Okay. So Don, if you would read now, this is from the Babylonian Talmud, and I bring this for a very specific reason that I'll share with you afterwards. Go ahead.
Okay. I apologize for my murdering these words or names, but
we have this rule we have this thing if you get to a name that you're not sure how to pronounce, we in Oram Mibar we just use the first letter. Just say S or J. That'll make your life easier.
all right. The 8 names of Sennacherib, Cherub, are as it is written in his regard among the kings of Assyria. Tiglath-Pileser, 2 Kings 15:29. Tiglath-Pileser, 2 Chronicles 28:20. Shalmaneser, 2 Kings 17:3.
Paul,
2 Kings 15:19. Sargon, Isaiah 20, verse 1, and the great noble Asenapar, Ezra 4:10. But isn't there an additional name, Sennacherib, S, meaning that his speech is contentious, S, leading to a quarrel and shame? Alternatively, he was called Sanherib due to the fact that he spoke Sa and snorted out Niher, contemptuous statements vis-a-vis the transcendent.
so you may ask, what is this possibly connected? This is because the names and the tradition of the names is not so simple. If we take the example of Achashverosh, the anti-hero of the Book of Esther, there is no Achashverosh in the annals of Persian kings. So there's all sorts of stuff. Was it Xerxes? Was it other people? The same thing here. In biblical literature, you have the names of kings that seem like it might be the same king with a different name, at least in the eyes of the rabbis who were compacting everything, right? They're not writing history. What they wanted to say here was, you think that in different biblical quotes, in biblical references, it's a different king. No, it's the same king that we hate. We hate that guy. And the second part is the most important. And you know why we don't like that guy? Look at his name. And then there's these word plays as to why he's called Sancherib, because he spewed it. He was a nasty guy. So I bring this because there's different names of kings, especially, that the commentaries of Tobit spend a lot of time trying to rework and looking at the different recensions. If we were to do this in an academic setting, like a master's, doctorate level, there would be various columns of each line we would never get anywhere, of course, right? But because the recensions, that is the versions of the ancient Greek, plus the Latin translation of Jerome, and the other Latin that we have, and the Aramaic scrolls from Qumran, we would get these various different changes of the name. What I want to say from this, from a Talmudic point of view, it wasn't that important. There was this lousy guy that we really hated, who was the king. That all our derision goes in that direction,
So,
and
David, when you look at this and you see the names in 2 Kings and you see the names in the Babylonian Talmud, don't you get the impression of an immense spread of people and distances that is being set as a foundation for the story?
or it's an immense spread of foundation of time and place that's been condensed for the story because the history is not important, but the story is important.
Yeah.
Do you get that distinction that I'm making?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Also, being aware of the Islamic theology and literature, I've come across many names that they have borrowed from Jewish literature, but changed them completely. So, you read the name and you go, who the heck is this? And then you Google it and go back and say, oh, in Hebrew, this was the real name. So, yeah.
Okay. Anything else on this section before we move ahead? Okay. Ajit, would you do the honors from verse 3?
Verse 3, okay. Tobit walked in the
Oh,
ways
so
of
sorry.
truth.
It's 3. It's verse 3. And it's I, Tobit.
Oh, Tobit.
Yeah.
Tobit, walked in the ways of truth and righteousness all the days of my life. I performed many acts of charity for my kindred and my nation, who had gone with me in exile to Nineveh, in the land of the Assyrians. When I was in my own country, in the land of Israel, while I was still a young man, the whole tribe of my ancestor Naphtali deserted the house of David and Jerusalem. This city has been chosen from among all the tribes of Israel, where all the tribes of Israel should offer sacrifice, and where the temple, the dwelling of God, has been consecrated and established for all generations forever.
For those of us that know the Hebrew Bible, this is surprising, right? Because the northern tribes, they were devoted to the alternative, which was in Samaria, or was, as we're going to find out, in Bethel, or in Dan. So from a theological point of view, Ajit, this is kind of novel in that at least in the story, you've got somebody from the other side who's saying, "Oh, but my people were wrong," which is obviously somebody from the right side.
He's pledging allegiance to Jerusalem, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Steve?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. I just felt like I was hogging the microphone here too much. So go ahead if you would read the passage from Kings that gives a little bit of background.
Okay. Jeroboam said to himself, now the kingdom may well return to the house of David. If these people still go up to offer sacrifices at the house of God in Jerusalem, the heart of these people will turn back to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and go back to King Rehoboam of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, you have been going up to Jerusalem long enough. This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. He set one up in Bethel and placed the other in Dan. That proved to be a cause of guilt, for the people went to worship the calf at Bethel and the one at Dan. He also made cult places and appointed priests from the ranks of the people who were not of Levite descent.
So story well known for those that have studied the Book of Kings. This
Hmm.
is the generation after Solomon, right?
Hmm.
The kingdom splits into two. And the way to capture the people politically is to capture them religiously. Um, uh, the two calves based on the golden calf story, or the golden calf in the desert based on this. Interesting issues when we're studying. Um, uh, okay, thanks, Wayne. Um, Interesting things when we're studying the Book of Kings. But what the author of Tobit has done here, he's placed himself in that ancient conversation and the purpose is, I think, to talk about Jerusalem in his own day, and perhaps to say we need to go back to the house of David. The house of David is not ruling over Jerusalem at that time. And if it is during well, it's before the Maccabees, but there are the dreams of the messianic dreams are still alive. Just because the temple is standing doesn't mean that there's not a messianic vision that needs to be fulfilled. Okay,
But
please, Les.
that's
I'm
confusing
not,
to me.
I've not read the Book of Kings, but this whole idea that one of the kings now is going back to worshiping golden calves, can you talk about that a little bit? And has that
Yeah.
ever been discussed?
So, so the Book of Kings is kind of goes back and forth. What's happening after Solomon dies? His son continues in one of his sons continues in his place, and then one of his servants goes and starts, something in the north because this is the punishment for Solomon not fulfilling God's will. That's how it's presented. And then the Book of Kings from 1 King 2 King goes back and forth between the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, two separate kingdoms related to each other, sometimes fighting with each other, physically killing each other, but always fighting with each other culturally. And the Bible that we have the Book of Kings we have, comes from the culture of the Judeans. So the way they told the story is, look what they're doing. And then some people say, Les, that the golden calf story didn't exist before. The historical fact was these golden calves that were thought to be the throne of God, and hence they say, this is your God. And it was inserted into the stories of the Torah, which were formulated after these historical occurrences, to say, look what our cousins in the north are doing. They're doing just like the Israelites sinned in the desert. But modern scholars say that whole story of Israelites sinning in the desert is based on the reality of the golden calves in the north. A little bit complicated, I understand. If you
Is there an
understand.
element of slander or libel there? They're just trying to,
Absolutely.
cast shadow to the other one.
Absolutely, yeah, and for our purposes is that the whole the Book of Kings ends with the destruction of the temple, and as my teacher Yarozakovich taught us, that the whole purpose of the historiographical books, that is the stories in the Torah, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the historical narrative leads up to destruction to teach us that we're suffering now, says the author, because of the destruction of the temple, the exile of our people, because of all the things that these people did. These people going all the way back to Abraham and Sarah, basically, with Hagar. But in this case, especially what the kings did. They lost the house of David should be the ruler. That's the messianic dream, the anointed one. And we don't have a house of David, a ruler from the house of David, because we have messed up. They have messed up. We have messed up. And I think that it's brought here in this context in Tobit in order to say that even though the temple is standing at this time, don't think that that's, we're still, there's still Israelites in the diaspora. The temple is, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Is that also explain somewhat of why the Christians or Jesus is shown in Matthew at least as a descendant of David? Does that have any relationship to that?
It has all the relationship in the world. Steve, I'll
Yeah.
let you talk about the first chapter of Matthew.
Well, yeah, I think also I just wanted to point out Matthew chapter 4, um, verse 12. Now, when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled: land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea, across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and for those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. So yeah, that's that messianic piece right there, tying into Naphtali and the Galilee and the longing for Messiah from the house of David, from 2 Samuel, chapter 7, I think. So I don't know, Ajit, if that gets at it, but I think all of this is in the ether that Tobit writes in. I mean that Matthew wrote in.
Yeah, and go ahead, Don.
I was going to ask whether there was any other reason other than religious for the worship in the Northern Kingdom of idols. Could it have been difficulty of travel, not wanting to carry money down south? I mean, was it totally religious, or was there an economic and practical point of people wanting to stay there and worship in their own venue?
Yeah, we don't know because we don't have the account from the northern kingdoms, right? We don't have documents from the northern. It's like how we know about Sadducees. We know about the Sadducees from the people that weren't them, right? We maybe have one Sadducee document, but we often know, and really important again to mention Bishop Stendhal's 3 rules for interfaith engagement, and one of them is you hear about the religion from the person who's practicing that religion and not necessarily from, it's funny to me to find articles on women in the New Testament, because I'm going to be teaching that after I do women in the Apocrypha, that are written by men. I mean, that's the way it was, but it's like, let's hear from women about, women in the New Testament, maybe perhaps, but also let's hear from Islam, let's hear from Baha'i, from the people who practice it. And I would say also, from my experience, let's hear from the people on the ground in churches as opposed to just the intellectuals who are writing, in the academic world. But back to your question, Don, I think that this is, while it's presented as a religious reason, it's also presented as a political reason, right? We don't want people to go to Jerusalem, right? Let's keep them where we are. Was it economical? I think they took they were taking advantage of an economical reality, and we're going to get to that actually in Tobit as well. A little bit about that economical reality of how do you continue to worship in Jerusalem. So why don't we go on with the next section? Les, would you read 5 onward?
All my kindred and my ancestral house of Naphtali sacrificed upon all the mountains of Galilee to the calf that King Jeroboam of Israel had erected in Dan, and on all the mountains of Galilee. But I alone went often to Jerusalem for the festivals, as it is prescribed for all Israel by an everlasting decree. I would hurry off to Jerusalem for the first fruits of the crops and the firstlings of the flock, and tithes of the cattle and the first shearings of the sheep. I would give these to the priests, the sons of Aaron, at the altar. Likewise, the 10th of the grain, wine, olive oil, pomegranates, figs, and the rest of the fruits to the sons of Levi, who ministered at Jerusalem. Also, every 6 years, I would save up a second tenth in money and go and distribute it each year to Jerusalem, giving it to the orphans and widows and to the converts who had attached themselves to the Israelites. In the 3rd year, I would bring it and give it to them, and we would eat it according to the ordinance decreed concerning it in the law of Moses and according to the instructions of Deborah, the mother of my father Tobiel. For my father had died and left me an orphan. When I became a man, I married a woman, a member of our own family, and by her I became father of a son who I named Tobias.
Okay, so a few things going on here. I think that we're not going to look at Numbers 18 and Deuteronomy 14 right now. Suffice it to say that the issue of tithing, a tenth of the crop, not only of the ground crops, but also of the animals of farming, a tenth of the farming produce, is a very, very tricky and complicated thing in the Torah. It's presented one way in the priestly sources, like Numbers, another way in Deuteronomy, what we call D. It feels like the tithe in the priestly sources, it goes to the Levites, yet in Deuteronomy, it goes to the Levites and the widows and the orphans, the poor people. With time, in rabbinic literature, everything becomes very, very organized that there's two tithes. There's the tithe that goes to Levites every year, and then there's a tithe that is sometimes eaten in Jerusalem, and sometimes it goes to the poor people, and that is in a 7-year cycle. I don't want to get too distracted with that. To me, if we were going to study the history of tithing, I would map out all the biblical sources, talk about how modern documentary hypothesis was part of the foundation of that is on this issue of tithing. Then, and I would get to rabbinic literature, but I would use this text on the way. This is a station on the way, in my mind, of midrash of the Torah. Figuring out how do we keep the laws of the Torah when there's contradictory rules, when it seems like they're talking about the same thing but in a different context. And this is what, in this paragraph, the author of Tobit kind of bridges that, gets all together for the purpose of lifting his character up, to say, look at what a tzaddik this guy is, look at what a righteous man he is. And as to your question, Don, about the economics, yeah, they took advantage of the fact that people didn't want to schlep all the way from the Galilee down to Jerusalem, or from the upper Galilee. And here he says, while all my friends and relatives, they were worshiping on the mountains, and also quoting texts from biblical literature as well, worshiping on every mountain, right? That's a reference there as to the people that weren't following. I was still true to Jerusalem, even though, I'm adding in parentheses, even though I endured great physical and economic hardships in doing so. Mm-hmm. And interesting enough, who does he learn all this from?
His mother.
It's actually his grandmother.
Grandma. Yeah.
Grandmother, whose name is Devorah, a name familiar to the prophet, the judge of Devorah. Does it mean the same one? No. But it does. This is what the author of this text does. He plants little hints to biblical stories and biblical images to ground and to root his character. And it's not by chance that he used Devorah. Devorah being this idea of a teacher, a feminist continuation of Moses from the Galilee. Devorah was in the Galilee, from the northern tribes, the northern tribes.
But he also comes across as an obedient person, too.
Yeah. Yes. And not terrible. Right.
Obedient, moral, religious person.
Right. And not terribly humble. Okay. And then we have that he's married to somebody from his own family. What does that bring up? Married to someone from his own family?
Oh, the Joseph story and Jacob. But family was defined differently, I think, in that culture.
Right. Well, even today, family is defined in different ways. So you're allowed in Jewish tradition to marry your first cousin, for instance. Right. In most in Nevada, I think you can, at least when I was a kid. Anyway, it doesn't. Yeah, I think he wants us to think of Jacob here.
So if we assume this is in Second Temple 200 BCE, who is his audience, would you say? The diasporan Jewish community everywhere, or?
I don't know. More brings up so many different views, and he leaves it up in the air. I don't know.
I have an opinion on that, Steve.
What?
Many of the writers of these books even the New Testament books, the Gospels, I don't think they ever thought that their books would be read or published or become part of the Christian Jewish canon. They wrote the books because they wanted their family, their children to read about them. I think if you went to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or any of those guys and said, hey, your book has been, what you wrote has been published as a book called the New Testament, they would be shocked. Right? That's what it's always my opinion that these people didn't expect anybody to read this stuff.
You know, in John's gospel, they talk about many books being written that weren't collected and published in a canon that didn't make the scriptures. So there may have been journals or novellas that people wrote that.
Yeah. The only guy that expected what he wrote to be read was Paul in the Christian theology, because he was writing letters to be
Yeah.
read.
Good point.
Okay. Well, I'm going to suggest that we call it a day here and we continue next week with verse 10. I know the pace is slow and I always bite off more than we can choose, but we spent a lot of time on introduction today. And I would imagine we'll do what's on the next page and a half, but also I'll add some more text from the second chapter as well.
But at least the stage is set, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we have this picture of this model Jewish man in the Second Temple. He's held up as a paradigm. It's ironic, given that he's the one who's saying he's all that. So there is some irony, maybe, but it also sets the stage for what happens. And much like in the book of Job, when he is the righteous one declared by the heavenly court. He doesn't say so himself, but he knows he's innocent. And so then I just think this picture, if we transport this into the gospel period in that first century, it's a lovely story. It's delightful. I like this guy and his son as they bumble along and are met by mysterious strangers and happenings, but it does feel like he is setting a benchmark for something to come.
Les.
Is it fair to say that this guy was from the tribe of Naphtali and he defected to Judah?
Well, ideologically at least.
And do we learn? I mean,
That would make sense.
It's philosophical, but is there any kind of tribal membership that goes along with that?
So, because this is not a historical account, right? It is somebody from the future reflecting, saying, this is who I was, this is this ideal person in the past. And while he lived in Naphtali, he still kept the real Torah, the real idea. So in that way, the character as defected, yet he hasn't exchanged his passport or his identity card, even though there was no such thing, right? But in any case, it's all moot, because if you see the next line is, after I was carried away captive to Assyria, right? In other words, what comes afterwards is him living in the land. So, it's, I don't know, I don't, without drawing analogies too much. Any other comments before we end for today?
Rabbi, I will miss your class, yours and Steve's class next week. I have something else on that.
So you can catch up as you drive to your next retirement activity. I actually don't know.
No, I'm actually speaking at a shul in Houston.
A shul in Houston.
Yes.
You and Mamdani using the word shul.
No,
I love it.
I'm speaking at Congregation Bet Yeshurun, and I don't know if you know Steve Morgan, who's a very good friend of mine.
Well, Steve, he was on in the beginning when we started our actively engagement. He was with us for a while. Yeah, give him my regards.
Yeah, I will. I do his adult class once a year.
That's great. That's great. Well, lovely to see everybody again. Hope to see more, and you can watch us. You can watch the recording.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
Thank you.